Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this CMCC webinar event, exploiting forest biodiversity to increase CO2 sequestration. My name is Antonio Trabucco, and I'm a researcher at CMCC, IAFES Division, and I will be moderating this event. Let me say that this event is part of the Festival of Sustainable Development, which takes part during the months of May and June, and will be organizing several events such as this. This event is organized by CMCC. CMCC is a foundation, no-profit organization, which mission is to investigate our climate system and its interaction with society. It's important because that also guarantees to scientific results to stimulate sustainable growth and protect the environment and elaborate what are possible adaptation and mitigation policies to cope with climate change. Next. CMCC scientific activities are distributed among 9 research divisions in Italy, which with different knowledge and skills in the field of climate science, climate modeling, impact of climate on agriculture, forest, and geological fields, but also data management and modeling of several aspects of climate and economics. So these are all topics that are taken together to couple viable and important results, which are used for develop information with outreach to scientific and public communities. So there are different strategies to develop and disseminate results, starting from scientific publication, but also education, communication, and events such as this one, such as this webinar. Let me introduce you the persons involved in this webinar. First of all, Alain Paquette and Simone Mereu. Alain will give us a short introduction, and Simone will give a presentation on the benefits of biodiversity on carbon sequestration. Alain Paquette is a professor at the Université du Québec in Montréal. He's mostly interested in effects of biodiversity on functioning and resilience of forest ecosystems, both in forests and in the cities. He's coordinator of the International Diversity Experiment Network with Trees, IDENT, which has several experiments running in North America and Europe, including also some in the urban environment. So his research makes use of control experiments, simulation, and long-term field surveys to test links and elaborate theories about biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. So he's engaged in shoveling clouds of data on diversity behind computer, but also enjoy field work and across several sites. And we hope to see him more and more often in Italy with us. On the other side, there is Simone. Simone is a colleague of mine at CMCC, IAFES Division in Sassari, which is currently involved in impact of climate change on agriculture, forest, and ecosystem services. He has a background in ecophysiology. In the last years, he emphasized his research on species interaction and the role of biodiversity on facilitating various ecosystem functions. This research is particularly important because it's useful to elaborate on possible and the best mitigation and adaptation strategy for the management of forest and ecosystem to cope with climate change. Is also coordinating and managing field sites as part of the International Diversity Experiment Network with Trees, with the experiment sites established in Mediterranean areas. As such, as this is deeply involved on intense work on the ground, as you know, and also on theoretical approach to understand the role of functional diversity on ecosystem services. I hope this is all. I should mention the we have at the end a Q&A section. You can use the question menu provided by the GoToWebinar system. You can send question anytime during the presentation. Please do it anytime. And we will collect the question at the end. We hope to answer all, or if not most of them, but we'll see the time. Anyway, we will elaborate the questions after, if we don't have time, and send them by email to each person which is interested. I will pass the floor to my colleagues. Alain, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antonio. Hello, everyone. So you've probably seen slides like these that, so at the bottom we have the big 5 mass extinctions, and on the top we have where we are now in white and what is to be expected in black. And so the question that you might have is, why should we care? Why should the loss of biodiversity affect us or affect ecosystems? Next slide, please. And so other researchers have asked the same questions, starting in 1994 with people like Shahid Naim and Dave Tillman, and then Hector Enal in Europe, who established really, truly pioneer experiments where they actually tested this very idea that fewer species or ecosystem with fewer species would lack functions or function at lower levels than would ecosystem that are more diversified. Next, please. So this actually created or gave birth to a new field of research, which we call biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And as you can see from the slide, starting like in 1990, there were like very, very few papers published on that topic. And by 2012, and I guess I should do that again, by 2012, there were already over 600 papers published on the topic on an annual basis. But just out of curiosity, if you go back to Darwin's original book, The Origin of Species, in 1859, he was actually already citing research done by gardeners that were arguing that in their garden, when more species were present, the plants grew actually better. And then for a long time, we pretty much ignored this idea until we were faced with these mass extensions, and then we asked, why should we care? Next. My own contribution to this a few years back was testing this idea on natural forests. So we'll be talking about experiments today, but also about the natural forests. And in Quebec, where I live and where I do a good part of my research, we tested this very idea that more diversified forests are more productive. And indeed, that's what we found. What we also found is that, contrary to what we initially expected, it's not the most diversified forest of the South. So around where most people live in Canada, for example, which is the temperate forest, it's actually in the boreal forest where fewer species and where harsher conditions are found that diversity had the greater effect on productivity. And that links to something else that I'll be bringing a bit later. Next, please. Since then, of course, I expected another slide, but that's okay. So what are the outstanding questions related to biodiversity? As you probably know, there's been a lot of work related to productivity. It's pretty much, and as Simone later will demonstrate, there's now very good support from forests, but other ecosystems as well, that a greater diversity provides for greater productivity. What are the next outstanding questions that researchers are facing in that topic? And that was actually the reason for publishing this paper, 1,000,000 and More Trees for Science, which is presenting the Treedivnet network. So in that network, we have well over 1 million trees. Well, we had well over 1 million trees a few years back already. Just for out of curiosity, the 1 million trees is the one in front of that picture to your left. It's actually to the right of the picture. It's a white pine, white Japanese pine that was planted in Montreal. And that actually links to where I actually work now, and I'll be speaking of that a bit later, but in the urban environment. But going back to the Treedivnet, so Treedivnet is well over 1 million trees planted for science now. It's over 20 different experiments. Some of them are in Italy and Europe, of course, also in North America, South America, pretty much all over the world where forests exist, we have experiments. Close to 5,000 plots, 3 diversity gradients, because we speak about the effect of diversity on the functioning of the ecosystems, but we also need to define what biodiversity is. But within Treedivnet, there are experiments testing species richness, also many of them testing functional diversity, but even others looking at genetic diversity of trees. So 25 experiments, 45 sites, over 6 continents, and a lot of researchers are part of this really interesting network. And this network aims at answering a number of questions. Part of them are, next, so the more theoretical questions, the ones that keep me awake at night sometimes, is what are the actual mechanisms, the biological mechanisms that might create these biodiversity effect. So it's actually almost easy to test this idea that greater diversity brings about more productivity. What's a bit more difficult is finding out how does that happen? So we've been testing multiple mechanisms, for example, that maybe you've seen that the papers at the bottom, that tree crowns adapt to each other according to the species of the neighbors they grow with in order to be more efficient at capturing light. We also tested the idea that greater diversity also means a greater diversity of microorganisms, other trophic levels that also provide for greater productivity by, for example, a better protection against detrimental organisms on foliage, for example. So these are outstanding questions. What are the mechanisms? Next. Another set of questions is, how about other important and not mechanisms, but functions of ecosystems other than productivity, which obviously will become even more important with climate change. So for example, an outstanding question is, does diversity provide for protection against stresses? For example, drought. So we all know that drought is predicted to increase in length, in size, and also in how often we'll be facing droughts. So are more diversified forests better protected against drought? It turns out that actually so far the answer is yes and no. So we'll be looking deeper into mechanisms, because this is getting quite important. And some of the most interesting later experiments within IDENT and within the Treedivnet are asking this very question. For example, the one in Macomer in Italy. Next. Another one that's really important to me, and that I guess will be important to you today, is how do we take this theory and apply it to actual forestry, where and how it really happens. And here in Canada, I've been working with foresters on how do we change. So you should know that much less actually than 1% of present day industrial plantations have more than one species in them. And there are multiple very good reasons for that. And for example, foresters are hesitant to change the way they've been doing things for very good reasons, if only because what we plant, we only harvest 50 to 100 years down the road. So we tend to not want to make mistakes. So we researchers have a responsibility, I think, to establish operational scale experiments where we do things at the size and with the equipment and with a number of species and a choice of species that will have an effect in the long term on how forestry is done if we really want to have a true impact on natural and planted forests. Next, please. The last one that may be less interesting today, but still is interesting given that most people now around the world actually live in cities, is the link between biodiversity and not necessarily ecosystem function, but ecosystem services. Services are what the functions actually provide to humans, and humans being mostly urban species now, the effect, or how can we, and I'm very much involved in research in the urban forest nowadays, and the urban forest actually faces a really big problem given what's coming to it, climate change, in that in most cities around the world, they all share the same problem, that very few species, most times 2 or 3 or maybe 4 species, compose well over 50% of the abundances. And we are worried about that, and we are looking for ways to increase the diversity of the urban forest. Obviously, in this case, it's not about productivity, but it's about resilience. And maybe you've heard, but we're facing a big issue here in Montreal and in Quebec and in most of northeastern North America, which is the emerald ash borer, which is killing all the ashes. And it might look trivial, but the ash is about 22% on average of city trees in northeastern North America. And so that's a big issue. That concludes my introduction now, so I'll pass the floor to Simone.
Thank you, Alain. That was really nice overview. And here now, what I wanted to talk about is, can we use biodiversity to actually increase CO2 sequestration? And to put that into context, just wanted to remind you the last IPCC report on 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. With current policies, we're aiming at 3 degrees, and already at 2 degrees scenario, we're going to lose 13% of ecosystems. And this risk would be halved by in a 1.5 scenario. Another example is coral reefs disappearing completely in a 2 degree scenario, whereas 10 to 30% could survive in a 1.5 scenario. So this 0.5 difference is actually a big difference. But to maintain global temperatures below 2 degrees, well, this requires drastic, aggressive action to reach it. First of all, we must provide all of our electricity, or at least 70% of that, from renewables by 2050. That, to me, is almost tomorrow. But even if we do so, even if we come to a zero emission scenario, we would still need to extract all the CO2 that we have pumped into the atmosphere. We need to pull it back. And there's, at the moment, only one way to do that, and that's by using forests, so increasing forest area. So the question is big. Land is limited. Can we use biodiversity to increase CO2 uptake? Well, let's see at figures at global forestry, first of all. Deforestation is slowing down, but still present. It was 11.5 million hectares per year in 1990s. And then between 2010 and 2015, it's 5.8. This comes from the Forest Resource Assessment of 2015 by FAO. And we still have a net loss of forest area. but also that is slowing down from 7.3 to 3.3. And then we have planted forests, plantations, which are increasing. They were negative actually in the 1990s, but lately they've been increasing at a faster rate. And at the moment, the forest area is nearly 4 million hectares, 4,000 million hectares, I'm sorry, while planted forests, they are about one fourth of that. So planted forests, if they were to increase at 2.4% per year, that would be able to satisfy all the timber and fiber demands that we have. And the current rate, at least an average between 1990 and 2015, is around 2%. And as Alain was reminding us, one problem is these planted forests, they are mostly monocultures. And monocultures of very few species of all the species possible. So these forests are not exploiting the possibility to increase their productivity by mixing species. So is it true or not that species richness can increase production, above ground production at the moment I'm discussing? Well, almost every article I see finds a positive effect on stand productivity. Two examples, for example, in a boreal forest, this was in Sweden by Gamfeld. They found up to 54% increase in production of stands with 5 tree species compared to monocultures, and also an increase in soil carbon stocks. In another environment, the Mediterranean, Villa et al., they found 30% of wood production in mixed forests compared to monospecific stands. So the numbers we're talking about in terms of wood production, these are quite important numbers, 20, 30, 54, up to 54%. And instead, another demonstration of the very strong biodiversity and productivity relationship. This is an article by Liang et al. In 2017, I think. I'm sorry, I forgot to put the date, where they did a global analysis. And this was possible thanks to an amazing database, the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative. So they were able to use 777, more or less, 1,000 permanent plots involving 44 countries and 13 ecoregions. And what they found, well, they had a bit of a different perspective, was that biodiversity loss would bring to a loss in forest productivity. And what you're seeing on the lower left is the result of their analysis at global scale, whereas what you're seeing on the upper right is how strong, in a way, the effect of diversity could be. It's actually the curvature of that of the curve you see on the left, which changes depending on the biomics. So one thing we must remember when we talk about using biodiversity, we should always remember where we are. Is it a wet place? Is it a humid or a dry environment? Because these relationships can change with climate. But it's not only a matter of higher productivity. More diverse forests could be more resilient to global change challenges. These include pests, pathogens, and climate change itself. Note that pests and it's also even more pathogens outbreaks are increasing worldwide, and they're causing a high mortality, as well as climate change, mostly at the moment, eventually because of extreme events, drought events. So there is evidence, although we don't understand it completely yet, that more diverse forests are also more resilient to these stresses. So if we could decrease the probability of, and by using it, if we understand it, we can decrease the probability of massive carbon losses due to mortality, which would feed back, by the way, into climate change. So advancements in biodiversity and ecosystem functions. As Alain was recalling, there's a long history in this type of research. But there's been a great change, because before it was observing the relationships with biodiversity, meaning species number, and a function, and then understanding why we were finding this, and some explanations were given. However, currently we've gone farther in unraveling the mechanisms underlying these diversity effects on ecosystem functions. And in my opinion, the main contributions are, on one hand, the multidisciplinary approach that we're following. It's not only anymore stand productivity and just studying the species interactions, is understanding how these are mediated by other trophic levels, for example, insects. So we're working a lot with entomologists. They are important part of the partnership, and soil scientists, because the microbial community is one important mechanism of interactions between species. And the other big step forward comes from trait-based ecology. Let me say a few words on that. Traits attributed to a species, these are morpho-physio-phenological attributes that drive species success in the environment. What we're saying is there's great data sets, for example, the TRI data sets, that's collecting traits for a huge number of species, and this data set is growing completely. And using the numbers, these traits for each species, we can, in a way, quantify and understand what's the function of the species, and so what strategy the species uses to use the resources in that specific environment. This is a big step forward, because it means we can quantify how the function of species within a mixed community. And things you can do, which are very important in this analysis with functional traits, is understand, for example, the functional distance. You can create dendrograms. The one you're seeing on the right is the one I used to select the species and the combinations in the experiment I'm following in Macomer. It's a manipulation experiment. So here you see that from a functional point of view, the species that are closer to each other, for example, the two on the left that you see, they are very similar. They're evolving, they're doing very similar things in the environment. Whereas if you take the one on the extreme left and the one on the extreme right, these species are using resources in a very different way. In fact, the two on the left, the very similar ones, they're both evergreen Mediterranean oaks, whereas the two more separate ones are an evergreen oak and a deciduous oak. So we can quantify the functional diversity within a community, which helps us understand the mechanism far more than what's usually used in biodiversity analysis, which is the species richnesses. And there's different metrics you can use, and one of the most common ones is the functional dispersion. So what I was saying is, just to understand what is happening, the positive relationships are not due to species richness per se, but on how much species differ in the way they use resources. So what you're seeing on the left, it's a schematic, a cartoon, representing the niche, ecological niche of two species, two very similar species. Let's say it's the two evergreen oaks I was telling you about before in my experiment. Whereas compared to the one you see on the right, which are two species that are highly different from each other. What happens at community level is that the niche, the breadth of resources that the community can use becomes larger. And that's one major reason why you can have a positive effect. You have more resources to use, and you're relaxing competition between species that use the same resources. And this goes under the complementarity effect. Eventually, you could also have facilitation effects. And that's when you get that, that's a very great thing that you found. So just to give you an example, shade-tolerant species allowed to harvest residual light in the understory of bigger species. So that's light that would be unused if the shade-tolerant species were not present. So at community level, the amount of light the community is using is actually larger than it is for the single species. This was just to explain you how much we have, because through this, it is through this that we're understanding the mechanisms that are driving positive relationships with diversity. So from now on, I'll speak of diversity instead of biodiversity. So large and growing trait datasets, forest inventories for information from observation and manipulation sites. They're allowing us to understand the underlying mechanisms of diversity on ecosystem functions. But the question is, can we today engineer, for example, planted forests with an increased capacity to uptake CO2, and that would actually increase our probability of reaching the 1.5 scenario? Well, unfortunately, there is no clear answer to that. And the evidence that we have is actually contrasting. We have contrasting results. First of all, we know that we can achieve a higher above ground productivity, but that does not necessarily bring to a higher CO2 uptake by the ecosystems. We have less knowledge on below ground biomass, which could in part offset what we see above ground. We have a bit less information on soil carbon stocks, which are important carbon, it's a very important carbon sink for the environment, and ecosystem respiration. So we need to understand a bit more how also these carbon sinks are modulated by diversity. But there are few articles addressing these effects, with some contrasting results. For example, Adair, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, in 2018, I think even Professor Paquette was involved in that. They saw no diversity effect on total carbon accumulation in forests in Quebec. And sometimes it was actually negative. But instead, Ruiz Benito in 2014, he did find a positive effect on total carbon storage. So that at the moment is an unanswered question. But diversity might not have a positive effect on ecosystem CO2 uptake if you consider the ecosystem by itself. However, if we, in our analysis, we also include the harvesting of wood products, especially for construction, in a way we are creating an additional carbon stock. And that could actually bring to a net CO2 uptake. So if we harvest wood before it rots, before it is decomposed, returning most of its carbon to the atmosphere in the form of CO2, then maybe we can get a net CO2, an additional net CO2 uptake. So, as I was saying before, we can increase our planted forests in order to satisfy timber demands. And that has, on one hand, a positive effect because it's alleviating or eliminating, hopefully, that's my hope, the pressures on natural forest, and perhaps we can have more space to restore them. And that would be an additional CO2 uptake for our future scenarios. But then we can use the planted forest for timber, and that could also be an additional CO2 uptake. But that's where biodiversity can come from. If these stands can actually produce more woods that we can use, then maybe we can increase our CO2 uptake proportionally a bit more. But of course, all of this needs analysis, further analysis, which needs to scale up and include also forest management into the biodiversity effects. And again, I would like to remind you that at the moment, though, all industrial forests are monocultures of few species. So challenges ahead, scientifically speaking, or more mechanistically speaking. We need new experimental trials to increase our knowledge on these mechanisms. And some of the that I find very interesting is understanding more the role of intraspecific trait plasticity. The same species can actually change to some extent the function it is playing inside that ecosystem, so that even that change in trait, depending on the context, can give a contribution to the ecosystem functions. And then we need to play with relative abundance. There's, to my knowledge, I don't think there's an experiment at the moment manipulating the relative abundance. We have even number of species in our experiments. And also stand density is a major question, because the way species interact can actually depend highly on the distance between the individuals. Multitrophic interactions and effects of diversity on net ecosystem are carbon uptake. This is to directly answer one of the questions we were stating before. So we also need to understand the effects of diversity on ecosystem functions at landscape scale, understand the trade-offs between ecosystem functions and between ecosystem services. We'll say a bit about this in a few moments. And we need to include interactions between ecosystem processes and socioeconomic drivers in our analysis. In short, what we need is to scale up trials. So about ecosystem services, something and multiple ecosystem services. This is again from Gamfeld et al. 2013. Some work has been done. And what you find is that the same composition of species does not, you're not able to maximize all ecosystem services with the same combination of species. So that, for example, you can increase gain production potential with a certain combination, but with that combination, that could be detrimental for bilberry production. So what do we do if we cannot maximize them all, but we need them all? Well, at the moment, the best way appears to be to have adjacent stands with different combination of species. And then these, at landscape level, you can provide multiple services. So this is why I say we need to scale up. We need to try planning our landscape to provide multiple services at the same time. Another trade-off that's very important, I live in Sardinia, where fires are, like in the Mediterranean, they're a major issue, but they're actually worldwide a big issue. And they are contributing substantially to carbon emissions. So they have an effect on climate change, but they have also a direct effect on climate by changing radiation and surface energy budget, cloud physics, and initiation of life cycles. What do we know about fires? We know that structural communities with a high structural diversity, these are more productive. Unfortunately, stands that have a higher structural diversity are also more prone to fires. And when you have a complex structural diversity, this can easily evolve into crown fires, which can be devastating for the ecosystems. So the question is, how do we balance for biodiversity and planning to, on one hand, reduce fire emissions from fire, and on the other hand, increase emissions because that community can actually increase its carbon uptake? And that is a big question usually have. It's a discussion I usually have with my colleague Valentina Baciu, which works a lot in fire. And she always tells me that my idea of forest management are completely crazy because I want to set Sardinia on fire. But then we came to a compromise. Again, it's on land planning. What you can do is simplify the structure where fires tend to start more easily and where damage could be greater, which is basically at wildland-urban interfaces or bordering areas of natural forests, and instead play more with biodiversity in more distant areas where fires are less likely to take over. But then there's also another question. Does diversity influence the post-fire recovery? So perhaps we could also find that more diverse communities could actually recover faster after fire. And my intention is to try this in the experiment I have in Macomer by actually having a artificial fire burning the experiment. I know it sounds crazy, but I think that understanding the post-fire dynamics or how they're influenced by diversity is really important and relevant. So potential of mixing tree species. We've seen now for industrial plantations, we've seen increased wood production, eventually resistance to pests and pathogens and resistance to climate change, but also additional benefits, because if we increase plantations and we do it with mixed plantations, in a way, we are also assisting species migration, which is of relevance with the ongoing climate change. And we're creating ecological corridors, and by using multiple species, we're also helping biodiversity conservation. Urban green, as Alain was mentioning, higher diversity would at minimum reduce the chance of abrupt loss of ecosystem services due to extreme climatic events or pathogen attacks. So this is where we could use it. And of course, forest restoration. Here we could lower mortality, for example, and achieve multiple ecosystem services at landscape scale. So we need opportunities for scaling up. These experiments require a lot of efforts because planting a forest, even if it's a few hectares, but of high density, is really a lot of work, also for maintenance. And if we want to scale up, I don't think we can just, it would be easy to find funds for large scale experiments. So we need a coalition with other projects. And what I think is a possible coalition is with restoration projects. Now I found a big one, which perhaps many of you know, the Great Green Wall of Africa. They're restoring 100 million hectares of degraded land and pointing at sequestering 250 million tons of carbon by 2030. So if we have a coalition with them and we simply ask, you're planting already, can we, for an area, can we do these trials? Then perhaps it can be easier to scale up our experiments and answer to the questions, to the big questions that we raised during these two presentations. Another opportunity, in my opinion, is a coalition with community forestry. community forestry, for those who don't know, are local communities, are forests where local community plays a role in forest management. So they're sort of self-managed in a way, but usually there's a number of actors. So again, they're planting and they're managing the forest, and perhaps a coalition with them could be possible to try at landscape level biodiversity experiments to answer the questions. And I think it would also be an opportunity by working with them to also promote the idea that species mixture of how species mixtures work, and that perhaps we can manage with diversity. And that was all. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Alain, for the interesting presentations and your points of view on this very interesting and complicated topic. I will collect few answers and just turn them to you. For instance, I have one here from Prem Neopan. I learned from both experts that more diverse forests are more resilient to pest, pathogen, and climate change. Nearly 99% of industrial plantation are monoculture plantation. Are there incentives and schemes and opportunities at large scale to encourage more mixed species plantations?
I think that people are working on that. Problem sometimes is with incentives with forestry that can actually may go in different directions. As far as I know, there aren't many incentives for mixed species, speaking at global level, but perhaps there are some depending on some countries. I don't know if Alain has more news about policies in this direction.
Not that I heard of. I think that so maybe there are though, maybe there are. I know I've participated in Canada and in Quebec in committees addressing this issue. So I hope there are incentives throughout the world to do that, but I think that we researchers have also a responsibility to provide answers to these questions by providing large scale, operational scale demonstrations that indeed it can be done, because it's been like that for quite some time now. And even in terms of equipment, in many places the equipment that is available is just not adapted. So we need to demonstrate that it's feasible.
Probably. Okay, thanks. Another question from Jeffrey Cho is if multi-species stands result in higher productivity and presumably greater volume marketable timber than monocultures, then what are the limits or what are the main limitations for landowners to establishing multi-species stands for profit maximization?
Well, it's connected to the previous question. Machinery, first of all, can be an issue. Second, again, our responsibility, because when you plant a forest for economic reasons, you're investing in something that you will harvest perhaps in 40 or 50 years. So you don't want to make mistakes. So if the question is which species mix allows me to actually have a higher yield, I don't think we're yet completely ready to answer that question. Sometimes we can, sometimes we already have examples. I think we can avoid negative effects, but harder to guarantee strong positive effects. Other limits, of course, so is choosing the species, machinery, Sometimes cultural. I think that we have lived for centuries, well, not centuries, but at least the last century, with the idea of monocultures. They produce more, easier to deal with. So sometimes it's a bit of the problem is simply in our minds. We need to change our attitude, I think. Yeah, I think these are the major limits to promoting mixed plantations.
Okay, so another question from Giorgio Matteucci.
Oh, hi, Giorgio.
Apart from the science case of investigating the effect of biodiversity, how planting mixed forests can be really operational? Interesting, yeah?
Thank you, Giorgio. Difficult questions. I think we need to test that first, because I am sure that the moment we move to landscape scale, we will find problems, issues we haven't thought about, and we will need to solve them. So I would start with participating in restoration projects and do some trials there. Perhaps use more public land to demonstrate where it works and identify problems. I think these are the first steps. I wouldn't know how it could be exactly, because we haven't done it yet. So I don't have a roadmap for this initiative. I don't know if Alain has.
Yeah, I do, and actually I show the way to do it for one particular type of forest. But in the slide, do you still have power over slides, Simone?
Yes,
maybe,
give me 1 second.
Yeah, maybe you can go back. So yeah, oh, that one, yeah. No, after that. Yeah, that one.
This
Sorry.
one.
So
okay.
That actually exists. I did this in 3 different places in Quebec, and this is replacing monocultures. So here, for example, we would be planting conifers. So in intensive forestry, they would be hybrid larch, which are the yellow ones, or they could be in normal plantations, they would be spruce, for example, white spruce or black spruce. And that's the way it's been done for a long time. And even the equipment, which is the harvester you see here, is designed to harvest forest according to laws and according to principles of forestry. And in this case, we made sure that we didn't even have to change the equipment. We just made the lines and the size of the different patches according to the length of the boom with which the harvester can cut the forest. And we even went further. So the yellow ones are the hybrid larch. They would be harvested first because they grow really fast. And if you look carefully, some of the green ones are also down. So that's a commercial thinning that we do in the same pass. So in the first pass, we do 2 things. We harvest a larch and we also do some commercial thinning in the spruce. So that's one way to demonstrate that, yes, it is feasible. And 2 species might not look like much, but please remember that most of those industrial plantations have only 1 species. So 2 is either +1 or multiplied by 2. It's twice as many species as we had before. And this is totally feasible. The other answer I would give to the initial 3 questions, I think, is that given climate change, given drought, given insects that are coming, especially here in North America, we have a lot of diseases that are coming. One cannot only look at productivity anymore. If you are to look at short-term productivity, what we need to look at is resilience and productivity for the long term. And for that, I think that the only answer, fortunately or unfortunately, the only answer that we have now as researchers and as foresters is through reducing risks. For example, the portfolio effect, right? We all know that we can't invest all our money into just one company. It's the same with forest. I think we need to reduce risks and increase resilience.
Then they were asking, which is the size of the stripes?
So the size of the stripes are about, I think it's the length of the, so that would be about, I would say maybe 9 meters for the size of the stripe. So normally the hybrid larch is planted every 3 meters. And the spruce is planted every 2 meters.
Okay, I'm trying to pick up some other questions here. A more ecological question. This is from Laura Basconi. Do you know if there are some threshold of biodiversity from which onward you have facilitation in forest, or even community of 2 species can do facilitation?
I would say that the number of species, there's no threshold for facilitation. Yes, you can eventually have facilitation with only 2 species already occurring. But facilitation is always complicated to detect. There are some examples though. One I really like usually is mixing species with different rooting depths. This actually occurs in some natural ecosystems where the species with deeper roots actually release a bit of water in the superficial layers, where species with shallower roots where water that then can be used by species with a shallow roots. That's one facilitation mechanism I really like, and it only requires 2 species eventually, one deep-rooted and one shallow-rooted.
Do you have did you have the slide from the GFBI, Simone? I think
I think I erased it. I'm sorry, Len.
No, but yeah. That's okay. I mean, there are
my slide. Yeah, 1 second. Here you go.
Yeah. So we see clearly at the bottom left that there's the relationship plateaus, right? And so the greatest increase in terms of effective biodiversity on ecosystem functioning are achieved at actually rather low level of species. The rest is more for resilience, replacement of species that actually have the same role as opposed to facilitation. So actually, it's not, in terms of forestry, it's not that difficult to get immediate responses in terms of complementarity and possibly facilitation, and also resilience of the forest. Only, and of course, the answer to that question depends on the ecosystem. Of course, a greater number of species is probably required in the tropical forest than it is in the boreal forest. But in the boreal forest where I work, this plateau is achieved after maybe 3 or 4 species. So yeah, it's easy to achieve.
Similar plateau, I think, also in Mediterranean, 4 or 5 species is already enough for reaching the plateau. And I think that's quite common, except for tropical biomes. Any other questions, Antonio?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions actually, but I think we are running out of time. It's almost 4 o'clock. Several people have asked to share the slides of the presentation. And I will just to tell everybody that we will prepare a report with all the questions, and the speakers here will reply to all of your questions by email. So the interaction can still continue for over the email. This is all very interesting. On behalf, I think I want to thank you all on behalf of the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, and to extend a warm thank for attending this event. Be tuned, because there will be more CMCC webinar organized in the future, and you will be informed by email. I want to wish you all a nice day, and bye-bye.
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.
Ciao.
Ciao.